Morning, everybody. Have you guys all checked your emails and Twitter and all those? I'm just checking that you sorted, and that your minds are at ease with regard to the social media stuff. We're going to try to make this a short yet productive morning. But also to indicate from our side that very, very grateful for 2 riveting days with some great ideas emerging. And we'll capture it in ways, hopefully, that do justice to the richness of the discussions, to guide us as we think about the pragmatic expression of the work that we have been talking about these past 2 days. The reflection session, of course, and you can jump in whatever way you like, and we'll see, what kind of interpretive schemes can emerge from this. I am, and I must say, from Dina and my side, and of course the CriSHET team, we're extremely thankful for the way in which you have participated in this discussion and the way in which you have shared your knowledge and your expertise and your experiences with us. And I know that there are people looking forward to the Monday, Tuesday session, so that we can, knock down the things that we need to do. The work of the academy is in different kinds of ways, highly dependent on good relations, and how people try and work together across various kinds of divides. And let me start with the reflections of yesterday, around the question that was raised during Shirley and Michelino's reflections towards the end. The one is that there will be multiple viewpoints emerging with within a broad set of parameters that one may call, an emancipatory or radical project around the university, and of course maybe not as a emerging study field, but as a political and intellectual program. Right? So that is what I sense from it. And within those set of broad parameters, there will be spaces for a number of iterations of how this particular program can take on a practical form. But I do think that the way in which we try to dislodge ourselves from schemes that have a particular kind of hold on us is an important first step that one needs to put on the table. And for that, the kind of thinking that has gone into the roundtables has been very instructive. In the morning session around the question of discursive fields, and you can see how these particular kind of things are tracked, over the 2 days, the question of, the theme of misrecognitions within the university space seems to be a theme that one has to put on the table for a program like ours. No? How patterns of recognitions and misrecognitions are distributed, whether it's along class or whether it's along racial lines or whether it's along gendered lines. So that broad particular theme is there. And then, of course, it comes with a kind of affective dimension that we will have to look at very carefully. And how we then respond to it in ways that doesn't imprison us in a form of Afro-pessimism or in a paralysis of thought is one way in which we have to think through that, without displacing its importance and its real material effects on people in this space. The question of the visibility and hypervisibility that our academics and students experience with what we more or less agreed on has been a colonial matrix of the existence of global higher education, whether you talk about predominantly African or black institutions or not, okay? Those kinds of things find different expressions. And it is true then, if I then jump to Viv's contribution, that if Mandani argues that the disciplinary architectures of the Western university is the one that has been imported into the continent, then of course it stands to reason that those kinds of epistemic violences will find epistemic correlations, and it will find effective correlations in the university space. No? And so the misrecognition is not simply a misrecognition of a body, but of a knowledge frame that gives kinds of recognitions to those kinds of to bodies. No? So the body is displaced by knowledge formations. And that understanding is not an easy one, you know, because sometimes you think that the over proximity and the over reiteration of it has to do with a kind of obsession with pain, but actually not. It is because of the limits of the language to explain those epistemic dislocations. That is the point. Pearl Sitoli always argues about epistemic squatter. To feel like an epistemic squatter is to feel it on the body. No? So we will have to really take that in ways that I have not thought of yet, but I know that the minds and experiences here would assist us doing that. Then through that, of course, Sue has put forward, four discursive frames, which I think does influence the way in which we think and do higher education. The one discursive, the first one is around the question of surveillance, which is then connected with Kabekaze's and Kopano's interventions here at the front. And how then, as a kind of decolonial move, that surveillance can be turned around in different kinds of ways. No? So that is the one. The second one is the discursive frame of meritocracy. No? And there has been sufficient reflections and writings, on the way in which the allure of meritocracy, infiltrates and permeates our practices as academics, even if we think we are not implicated in it. No? Yeah. Sue Ming's question around, are we now going to unexamined examinations, or assessment and so on. So that's the question on the table. And then the third one, which I also think it's very powerful, was the idea of the decontextualized learner, the decontextualized learner, which is also a function of knowledge formations, okay? Because maybe the knowledge requires the decontextualized learner to make sense of itself. No? And the fourth one is the pervasiveness of human capital logics within the higher education system. So there we have it in that space now. Broad discursive frames around misrecognitions, surveillance, meritocracy, the decontextualized learner, and human capital logics. Then the second one on emancipatory imaginations, which of course, as you can see that it ties up with the broad theme. There's almost like both frames coming through, imaginations coming through, and kind of options for positioning. So it's rebellion, repair, or death. Right? Yeah. That's so those are the kinds of options for how to think through this. No? And whether an autopsy as a form of getting knowledge, after the system has been taken off life support is a way to go, okay? So the disruptive forms that comes through those are very instructive. But of course, then the theme of the previous day around entanglements, about how practices are more or less located in so many myriads of ways, requires a careful thinking about whether rebellion, repair, and death may not be parallel moves within the way in which we situate ourselves. And then the interesting thing is that the spectre of Foucault now seems to have seems to have replaced the spectre of Marx in modern times. But we know that it stands proxy for something. Né? It stands proxy for epistemic displacement. Né? And so, and I actually love that discussion because the productive tension, it is so, the agency located and the possibilities located in it is so obvious. No? And of course, the way in which Tsepo always argues about the engagement of the Western forms of disciplining things that became dominant in our space is very instructive. And it reminded me of Masolo's comparison between Mudimbi's work and Foucault's work, the archaeology of African knowledges, in a thoughtful, respectful way. So there is a way in which one have to engage with these frames and work through it, and not necessarily in an obsessive opposition to it. Because that opposition is also a form of recentering it, of making it more important than it is. Okay? So there, of course, one has to think about, and this is a post-structuralist thought from Lyotard, actually, the mirror of oppositional thought, that reinscribes that thing that you want to fight against. So there is a particular kind of warning around how we engage with how we think through this. And that is not the only one. Mbembe, clear-cut case, delusion, And of course, the critique of black reason has also a critical engagement with post-structuralist thought in various different kinds of ways. That conversation is not to write Africa by analogy, but to find different ways of thinking through what is on the table already. And then Abu Dere, of course, Africology, straightforward Foucauldian in the way in which he treats those kinds of knowledges. So what I then think coming through is the question of whether it's capable for us to have a kind of epistemic freedom where you have different knowledge sets conversing with one another in the space. And this morning when I was thinking about the session, I thought, is it possible to think of whiteness as a field in the context of how Bourdieu used it? A distribution of already established positions that one has to engage with within the university space. Outside of the context of pigmentation and color and all those kinds of things, but as both a discursive field and also as a field, an academic field, in the context of the university's architectures. So then coming back to then that, of course, the communities of care that Sue puts on the table as one way of engaging with what whiteness tries to displace, or the forms of misrecognition that whiteness puts on the table. And, of course, the returning of the gaze in a different direction is one form of unshackling the imagination for how that may happen. So the question that Paul Zeleza, was one of my favorite African scholars, was Amos's vice chancellor, is whether we can find ways of writing our continent without analogy, without another reference point. Simon Zioki has done a great PhD on non-comparative thought when we engage with our continent. Strangely enough, also a Deleuzian study for that matter. But of course, he brings Deleuze not in conversation with African scholars, but African scholars in conversation with Deleuze. I hope you get the slight difference in between those. And in the session on the African University, Kopano, I must say that you were right when you opened yesterday, when you said that there is a particular kind of connection between that roundtable and what you and the book launch, which for me, of course, was beautifully crafted in the way in which one can think the meaning of African if you use it in the context of, say, for instance, African psychology, with almost like a reconstitution of the subject to orient itself so that that African can find meaning in the way in which academics work can be practiced as well. And so I literally saw in that, so many practical pathways for how one can make sense of the meaning of African, which of course was the title of that earlier roundtable, which I found to be highly, highly productive. So for that group, thank you so much for putting in the energy in preparing for that. The university is an art of living. And of course, then in that space, it's so strange that the Kachanian global thesis around epistemic architectures that more or less frames different sets of academic behaviors on the continent seems to, from that particular panel, suggest that both the disciplines and the politics of knowledge seems to a particular area within which critical university studies has to engage with, if we have to make sense of the reconstitution that Kopano has put on the table via the work of himself yesterday, And so the idea of knowledge and context, the committed intellectual, in response to how Viv puts forward the thoughts of Mandani, Amos's and Michael's, contribution with regard to how particular kinds of social worldviews can be located so as to make the African, emerge as African within the particular designation of the African University. And so, towards the end of the day, we had the book launch. Kopano, thank you so much for choosing Nelson Mandela University for this. Give him a hand, man. And I've already referred to both Shirley and Michelinos's reflections, at the end of yesterday. So for now, I just want to check with my co-conspirator, Dina, whether she would like to say something. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andre. You're so eloquent. There's hardly a little space there to contribute. I really wanted us to just, I guess, in foregrounding the next session, to give a sense of its importance, I guess. I mean, underpinning so much of what we've been discussing about the impossibilities of universities and the ways in which they exist, the violence of them to peoples, to knowledges, to the ways in which we conceive of alternatives, is in a sense hopefully going to come out in the discussion today. And I'm not trying to sort of guide the contributors. I think they're going to do a fantastic process of discussion. But it's in a sense, I guess, to try to make sure that before people leave by the end of today, that we have properly wrestled with the marginalization of some of the issues and terms that fall under what is constructed as race, gender, and all the protected and marginalized characteristics of what is considered other within the mainstream of the Universal Academy. Many of us are sitting here as academics, as scholars in this field, but also practitioners who have been tasked to inform, give guidance, or change universities or the funding systems of universities, myself included. And I think it's a unique opportunity for us across the world to try and find some ways of problematizing this pragmatically, And so really, this is, in a sense, not a contribution or a reflection to the last few days, because I think we've all been talking about this, but to bring it to bear with full presence as we go forward now, and to make sure that both the South African voices, the greater African voices, and those of you coming from other contexts really do contribute in this next discussion, and that contribution is on record. Thank you. Thank you, Jenny.
Okay, good morning. As Dina was saying, our next session is titled Gender, Race, ... That's one of Andre's favorite punctuation marks. And and the limits of university transformation and or critical university studies. So obviously, under those ellipses fall a whole lot of categories of dehumanization, I suppose. And I think it might be interesting later in the discussion to consider which ones have come to the fore in the discussion so far and which ones have remained unspoken or marginalized. I'm not going to say much because I want to get into the panelists, but I was just thinking of, with these categories of dehumanization, and obviously they're interlinked as the theory of intersectionality kind of explains. And I was thinking about the limitations of that kind of thinking. Obviously, intersectionality has sometimes been critiqued for the way in which it breaks down these very complex interrelations into these categories that are then sort of separated out. So in the very attempt to look at the interrelations, sometimes that's missed out. And also how then in transformation processes, especially when they become sort of formalized in transformation at universities, how those categories can kind of become emptied out of what they actually mean for people, and in that sense, what transformation should really be about. So you kind of end up with tokenism or equity quotas in ways that don't actually transform the university. And I was just thinking how trying to think about these complexities and to think about these categories in ways that actually link to real people's experiences. One way to do that might be to look into more creative kind of methodologies, look to literature, to the arts, to music, and what that might offer to critical university studies and to thinking through higher education transformation. So on that point, can I call forward Nancy and Aslam and Jason? I'm very excited for this panel. Thanks. Is this on? Yes. Okay. So I don't know if anyone wants to go first. Okay, Aslam will go first. If you want to stand at the podium, that's fine. Otherwise, you can sit. Okay.
No, I want to actually stand. Okay, so I've got 2 pages of notes. Thank you very much. Andre, thank you very much. And Dina, thank you very much for the wonderful opportunity. The title of my presentation is The Psychic Life of Race in the Institutional Culture of the University. Hopefully, by the end, that will be clear. So, I am interested in taking very literally why we have been brought here over the last couple of days and the next couple of days. So I want to develop for myself a methodological explorations in critical higher education studies. And I think that the important task methodologically is to insert in that process the centrality of concepts. Concepts by which we can elaborate languages of description to build arguments, to build critique, and to build a reference base by which we can further build and develop a set of arguments. I want to suggest that it's not fundamentally the concepts that must precede the study. I want to suggest that it is the question that we ask. And it's the nature of that bringing that question into being that ought to lead the conceptual purchase and the conceptual development. So the question for me is, what is the question? And then immediately, what is the archive by which you answer the question? So typically, what is the archive for the slave, for understanding and researching the slave who has no written history, for example? We have to develop concepts. The psychic life of race is a metaphor that allows me to bring my own experiences as a black academic to the scene of the University of Apartheid, as our colleague Pramesh Lalu calls it, into view. My multiple roles are that of a professor, a vice dean, an HOD, a council member, a member of 5 transformation committees, and hopefully a networker of progressive activities across the university. Metaphorically, I am animated by things such as Mbembe, who speaks about the African American archive, and he speaks about racism as the calcification of bones. That the logical outcome of racism is the production via the calcification of the bones of the slave. I'm also metaphorically animated by Goldberg in his book in 2009, where he speaks about racism as a shroud, as spectral, as ghostly. But that's at the metaphorical level. How do I move to the conceptual level? I want to give you one small vignette, a story that I experienced myself. When I landed at Stellenbosch University in 2009, I was immediately placed on the Bursaries and Loans Committee. In 2012, came to understand that people bequeathed the inheritance to the university on the basis of race. So they would say, this bursary amount is located for a white Afrikaner person in Bethelsdorp. We then raised an issue with that, and eventually succeeded in having the issue lodged at the Cape Supreme Court in order to overturn that. So given the constitutionality of the new democratic dispensation, I thought that that was pretty easy, which it was. The High Court announced that that's illegal and it needs to be removed forthwith. That's after 3 years of High Court, of working with the Constitution, working via the legal process. The High Court judgment comes back to the Loans Committee. This is after 3 years. And the Bursaries and Loans Committee decides that we need another 3 years to implement it. Not immediately. There is an enormous dispute by myself and one other person to say, but the High Court was clear, we've got to do it immediately. Argument is made. The chairperson of the meeting looks around and says, let's vote. But before we could vote, he looks around and says, 10 against and 2 for. So you can imagine how that breaks down racially, and the 3 years of extension is awarded. That to me is the psychic moment of madness right there. How do I respond? I respond by saying, obviously he didn't even ask what I was voting for, he just read my body. Psychically, well, actually, I raised my voice and I said, I actually agree with the 3 years. Psychology of madness. He looked at me, and I don't know who was more mad at that time, him or me. So I wanted to explain that. What happened there? Was that the ghost speaking? Did the wall speak at that particular moment in time? That is the depth of the institutional culture speaking back to you. Now, normative theoretical frames about institutional culture and climate does not get to this problem at all. How do you get to that? It forces one at the conceptual research level, as far as I'm concerned, to firstly historicize the event. So I want to suggest that historicization is key to the decolonial project. I'm speaking to a form of decoloniality that's ahistorical, that's acontextual, that's a-exigent, that reads text as if the text were written now, right now. Historicize that spectral moment that I described to you in the 1948 moment at Stellenbosch University, where apartheid was re-articulated. It re-articulated a kind of a liberal, benign version of colonialism, conquest, and coloniality. In 1948, something else happened. Moving along that track, state power at the 1948 moment was mobilized to give race a hard institutional life, which 50 years later, no, how many years now, 70 years later, lives its psychic dimensions in the way it frames us. The notion of knowledge and science is mobilized in the early years. And by the way, this happened over 30 years. From about 1955 until about 1985, that was the project, 30 years, where race was mobilized in this particular way. After that, it lives its spectral life. Architecture, ideology, politics, space, forced removals, educational languages, positive science, state power, municipal power in the Stellenbosch region, clearing ground, moving people out, establishing the vision of the Afrikaner nation state during that moment became the articulating frame by which race hardened and developed a life of its own. So you ask the institutional question, and the spectrality that I was explaining in my vignette, historically, that's where you have to locate the explanation. So, 2 more points. What we're experiencing in the current moment will depend on sociological readings, descriptive readings. And it starts from understanding how and where the archive would emerge. And I would say the autobiographical, as I'm suggesting it today, is a starting point for that archive. But deep ethnography, critical observations, finding ways of explaining via understanding, and so on and so forth, will provide a kind of a sociological descriptive veracity to what we're doing. So what's the situation? What's the set of conclusions that I can make about institutional culture at Stellenbosch? Of course, I'm truncating the explanation. We have opposing ontologies. I'm only using the word ontology because I want to sort of show its beingness, its complexity. I'm not even sure I'm using the word right. But there is 2 binary ontologies at play here, and life plays out in the middle. The one is the ontology of conquest. The idea that the space is enshrouded by an ontology of conquest which strategically, or maybe ontologically at this point, is expressed powerfully in its mobilization of silence and silencing. At the other end, it's met by people like myself who enunciate an ontology of disposition. That is how the space positions. By the way, I am not positioned like this in my social context where I live, or at my previous university where I was, or when I move outside of this. But fundamentally, when you operate at Stellenbosch, you are positioned in respect of an ontology of disposition. From where you announce via your body, your affect, opposition, which is managed in particular ways by the shroud and the ghostly, which is networked out of the town, out of the rugby playing, out of the old money, out of the new money, that frames the ontological response from the institutional culture. And so within the ghostly dance between these two types of ontology, therein lies the sociological story that needs to be told in our ability to excavate it via an imaginary archive that we have yet to imagine. History, historicizing, sociological description, and my answer to last night, the psychological that excavates the ontology of disposition vis-a-vis the ontology of oppression. That's the space in which the psychological ought to develop a set of languages. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say, hello, everybody. Okay, so as many of you found out yesterday, I'm in English literature. I don't have anything prepared. I'm revealing my. I'm going to have your notes on what you said. I'm going to talk anecdotally about my experience and about my teaching practice, and then you're welcome to take from that. Because I'm not working on developing any critical university studies. My research is not in that space at the moment. At the moment, I'm quite interested in writing on pop culture and hip-hop. And my PhD, as I say that, my supervisor's looking at me. So what I wanted to talk about was the idea of practice and / as performance. Because I feel like that's the space of the black woman academic. You are constantly in a space of performance, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. So outside the classroom, the performance is that you constantly have to show that you are doing your work, because the assumption is that you are not doing your work or you are not doing it properly, right? So, for example, recently students wrote a complaint about my course, students who I'm not teaching, they're on a different campus, and they make up about 8% of the overall module, someone else is teaching them. So, but I have to mark their work. Ms. Morkel is an unfair discriminatory marker because I teach English literature. Just keep this in the backdrop. This is the canvas upon which the story is painted. An unfair and discriminatory marker because she deducts marks for incorrect spelling in a literature test, even though there's only one consonant or vowel missing in a word. Right? That was one of the complaints. So now, this complaint is not brought to me, it's brought to my manager. So the first narrative of performance under which I must perform is that, Karen, I want to speak to your manager narrative, right? They don't want to deal with you, you get, I want to speak to your manager. So then I have to now write back because I know my manager's response is always going to be to default on the student. The fact that the director of a school in another faculty sent this email around to me and CC'd my line managers in mean they automatically believe this to be a legitimate complaint. So now what must I do? I must perform. So I spend about 2 hours formulating a response to this overall email, and under that section where the student made one comment, I have to write about 8 lines worth of why spelling is crucial and foundational in understanding and generating a response to literature. Okay? So now that's the type of work I must put in. So it's the emotional labor, but then it's also the labor of you constantly have to validate that you somehow belong here. Then there is my moment of my interview. I applied for the post here, coming from Fort Hare, to teach African literature. And so in my interview, I had to rehearse now Pan-African studies, all the big names, negritude, all the way to Biko. You know, you have to like perform, you have to show that you got your notes. So I come in strategically, morning everyone, put my book on the table, and then you just give a lecture basically as your interview. Being forewarned that you are not the favorite candidate who's coming to this interview, you know? You are not the one that they want to hire. The person who they want to hire is actually a linguistics person for your literature post. So now you go and you perform and you give a big lecture, then you still get asked something. You respond, you respond, you respond. Afterwards, you get the phone call, oh, happy day, you got the post, right? Your interview was all about African literature. You come in, you get given romanticism, literature of the romanticism, and after, so you have to teach the romantics and you have to teach Victorian literature, and you have to teach postmodernism. It's too late to change the syllabus, so you are teaching Jeanette Winterson. Who else was on the syllabus at the time? You're teaching Jeanette Winterson. There's no African literature on the syllabus. Nothing that you had to perform in the interview. So you made a spectacle of yourself to show that, you know, my degrees, they are valid. You know, the people who wrote my references, they aren't lying to you. It's not a network of, I don't know, people who lack integrity, who have somehow vouched for me for the past so many years. Okay? Then there are, let's think of something that might have happened, recently. So, and this is where the practice and the performance meet in terms of what happens behind the scenes, because I've told you about all the behind the scenes things, but I'm hired to teach. So now there's a space where you must navigate into the classroom, and as a black woman academic, I feel I can't just go into the classroom and speak. Like even today, I'm sure that you saw yesterday, I was sitting at the back there. I think Andre walked past, Jenny walked past, but I was collating slides after slides after slides of evidence for today, you know, from my teaching practice, getting people the music videos that I play in class, the lovely GIFs, the pictures of all the important, you know, poets, and this list of themes and subjects. And I realized this is because you're so used to having to perform your knowledge, make a spectacle of yourself, to have it even conceived of that you could be, maybe belong here, that maybe what you were saying is worthwhile for us to respond to in an essay or a test. So, I mean, I was tired yesterday because I taught in the morning. So I come from a spectacle to now having to prepare for tomorrow's spectacle. And then I just messaged Jen and I said, look, I've got no backup. I'm not bringing my slides. Because if this is supposed to be a safe space, why must I go through? And if I'm going to be critiquing this model that I have now claimed as my own, because I know that there is a sense of misjudgment every time I step into the university space, why must I now bring these slides? If you don't believe me, you let me know. Then the onus is on you to say, Nancy, show us your slides, man. Email me. I don't believe that you have quite slides, you know? So, because then it's also, why do I tell my students these things? Because now I have a friend who's a student in media, and she's a Xhosa lady, and she is writing a script. Now, last year she wrote a horror script, right? Because she loves horror. That's a genre. And I'm like, I can't read this thing. Someone is getting murdered in a ceremony in a hospital, and all this things going on. It's like, no, this year I want to write this. So we're both sitting in the library, because for me, the library is a safe space. Because now I don't have colleagues coming by and questioning, oh, so-and-so said this. Oh, you know, the students are quite upset. I go to the library, because my colleagues are not there. That's far from my office. I'm not being given last minute. No one else is around. Nancy's always here in the office. Nancy, can you just put together this thing? Because you're there, you're the young black academic, you must do it. So I'm sitting in the library, and the student's there, and then she's writing this thing. She says, you know, do you think that she, meaning the lecturer, do you think she's going to want me now? Well, I have to put in subtitles for the Xhosa that I use. So I had to stop, and I just had to interrupt both of our work processes and say, is that a question that you need to ask? And this is going back to me as a language, as an English literature teacher. Because English literature is so closely associated, it's like bed friends with power and colonialism and empire. And in South Africa, English, what you know about English, how you speak English, how you sound when you are speaking English, the fact that people can say about you, oh, you speak so well. You know, that is a marker of your belonging, that's a marker of your intelligence, that's a marker of your excellence. And I'm well aware of that as an English teacher. And so I have to highlight to the students that as much as I'm aware of this, as much as I worry constantly that I'm complicit with the dynamic that English literature, the discipline that I'm in, allows, I also have to constantly navigate, like, why do we think like that about English? So I had to sit with my friend and tell her, look here, this is not for you to ask this question. You write your script the way you want to. Your script writing lecturer should come to you and say, you know, I have to mark your work by November, December, and I don't really have the tools, the linguistic resources. I don't understand Xhosa enough. And when I go to the dictionary or Google Translate, I suspect there's an incorrect translation. Can I ask you, please, as a favor to me, your marker, to translate the parts of your script that have got Xhosa in them into English? Because then you are not automatically sitting as a shamed student, a shamed subject saying, oh, I shouldn't, you know, because this module is not really for Xhosa students. Writing a movie script, a real movie script can only be in English. You know? And it's also, the lecturer doesn't have to sit there convinced that, oh, obviously if it's in English, then it's better than something that I can't possibly understand. But that is what my students deal with every day. They have to constantly wonder about their ability. They have to wonder about their creative project. They have to wonder about their critical work constantly, because it's the space of where English has got like this hold on everyone, man. And I find that with the media students, and it's even more intense with my literature students. So, do I still have some time, Jenny? Please, just 2 minutes, please. So I'm going to tell you what I do in practice. In practice, in class, I have 575 first-year students. I have to teach them introduction to poetry, alone. Now, the moment first-year students, 18, 19-year-olds, come into the lecture hall, and the first thing they encounter is poetry, all the nerves, all the lack of confidence comes into play, right? Then you have all the apologies. Who are the students bringing apologies to me? Black students. Students who are not first language English speakers. They come up to me after class and they apologize. Before anything else happens, they say, ma'am, you know, I'm not very good at poetry. And it's always this trying to humble themselves for apologizing that I'm in your class and, you know, poetry, I'm not good at it, ma'am. And you know, my English is not really so. Constantly having to apologize for themselves in this class. But if the students want a degree, they're told they have to register for this. And I know we don't have the resources. We don't have a tutorial program, the funding is cut. We don't have marking assistants, funding is cut. So what am I supposed to do? I don't have someone to give the students feedback. We don't have a bilingual tutorship program anymore because that program only ran for 3 years. So now we don't have the mechanism to give these students the confidence to even begin the program. How do I expect my students to end the program? So that's just in terms of the language. And then I have to sit and speak to students and say, you know, this apology, you're not supposed to be apologizing. If there's something you don't understand, you have to come to me, we have to work on this. We'll go through it. Then there's also the way English literature courses are taught. Many of you, I'm sure, have studied English literature. You always get given this chronological account of literature, right? English literature, the Middle Ages, Chaucer, thank you! Woo! Chaucer and Beowulf, and then you see Beowulf and you're not even like, how must I pronounce this? Beowulf. What is this thing? You know? And then you're sitting there, and then with Chaucer, but you know, I was very fortunate. I found one book in the library when we were studying Chaucer, and I read it. It had the Chaucer English, which is this very weird, unrecognizable English. And then on the other side, it had a modern English translation. So I would like go hide it by the statistics books or something and then go back to it. But then you learn Chaucer, then you learn, don't reveal this to my librarian. And then you go to the Renaissance of Shakespeare, you know, and everybody, Shakespeare is the king of love and this and so great, okay. Then you go from Shakespeare, yes, Wordsworth to the Romantics and Blake. And then at the end of the module, because you've gone through English literature as if it's this historical progression of the thought from England, at the end of the module, all of a sudden, Harlem Renaissance, but you only do Langston Hughes, no? And then you do Soweto poetry. And you do it unironically, you know it. You do it unironically, you don't question, why is it saying Soweto poetry there? Is it because that is easier for you to encapsulate than saying black South African writing of the struggle? Okay? So that's the way English is traditionally taught, poetry. So now what I do is, I teach the course thematically. So the opening course is, and it's not ahistorical, I can see you. You started judging now. So what I do is, the opening themes are poetry as and about art. So basically, now when I teach Shakespeare in that thing, I don't teach him as this great God who taught us all the sonnet, you know, because Claude McKay won't exist if Shakespeare didn't exist. What I do is I say Shakespeare's using the sonnet. We have long been interpreting the sonnet as this beautiful aesthetic piece, but he's actually using it to navigate history and to navigate the problem of our mortality. But now, then I dispense with it. Finished. So the Renaissance, and I talk about the context. So what is it? So I have Shakespeare, next to Shakespeare I have Linton Kwesi Johnson, if I was a top-notch poet. Also talking about poetry as a work of art and about the work of art. And then I look at the language LKJ offers, look at his form. We can watch him, we can see him, we engage with him, you giggle while you're listening. I hear students sighing, going, you know, and they're just knitting themselves. And then I say, so we can look at him alongside Shakespeare. Each has their own political project. Each come from different periods. We look at them within their historical context, but the assumption isn't that the one is superior to the other. Okay, thank you, Jenny. My time is up.
Get a mic in front of you. First thing you want to do is sing. Right. First things first. Good morning. How's everyone keeping? Is everyone okay? Good stuff. I'm not really a morning person, so I'm going to need your strength. I need your help. So just following on kind of from what Nancy said is really interesting because, well, apart from the fact that the anecdotes are really funny, I think humour has become a really interesting way of alleviating the kind of physical and visceral impact of racism. And it's one that it is funny to listen to. And I often engage with that myself. I like storytellers. You know, I think I always say Shirley Ann's a fantastic storyteller and how humour's used. And I've watched Andre kind of use humour in the last couple of days as well. And I just think it's a really useful tool for racism. But I suppose it's kind of the old adjective where if you don't laugh, you'll cry. And I think when I kind of think of racism and I think of how people negotiate that on a daily basis, there is kind of a stigma that leans towards that kind of laughing and crying thing. So it's kind of like make light of it. And then if you cry, you're kind of seen as, particularly if you're a person of colour, you're seen as kind of weak, or you're seen as someone that's not robust or doesn't have the kind of mental resilience to deal with the trauma you're encountering. And I suppose one of the things that's kind of really interesting about what Nancy said is that idea of performativity, you know, having to almost adopt these two different types of people. Now, one of the interesting things my dad gives me a lot of advice that isn't always very complimentary. So I remember him saying to me, Jason, like, you know, the best piece of advice I could give you when I became a teacher, he said, be yourself, because you're not intelligent enough to do anything else. So I said to him, like, so my mum said to him, you're going to have to explain to Jason where the compliment is. He's like, no, he knows it. And so I said, like, Dad, what do you mean? He said, the thing is, Jason, you're good at being yourself. Like, so often what he was saying to me was, and he explained it afterwards, instead of showing off in front of my mum, was that black people have to often adopt two personas. There's the work persona, and then there's the persona that you are in comfortable spaces. And what he said is, Jason, you know, you don't have the intelligence to do that, but that's actually a blessing. And what he said is, be yourself. Being yourself will be enough. And what's interesting is not having to change in that space, but then you recognize the agency you get as a black male, particularly in a UK context, where you're allowed to kind of be like that. And there's two ends of the spectrum in the UK, which is really important to kind of conceptualize what I'm talking about. There's the gang affiliate as a black man. These are the racial stereotypes we work within. Then at this end, there's the educated black man. The educated black man is fetishized. I remember my dad saying to me and my brothers growing up, do you know what white women love more than anything? It's like, what? An educated black man. It's like, you do that and you'll be all right. And it was really interesting him saying that, because what he kind of was saying was this idea that they work off this premise that if you're not educated, then you'll be there. But in that continuum, there's actually nothing in the middle, which is obviously untrue. But what it does kind of suggest is this idea that black men have a particular position in British society that are educated. Now, what's interesting is that same position of privilege isn't afforded to women of colour, in particular black women. So you can be as educated as a black man, but actually you're always at the bottom of that spectrum, no matter what. And actually, if you show any kind of assertiveness, any kind of intelligence, whatever form that may take, actually it's kind of ridiculed and it's seen as, that's not your place to occupy that space. So it becomes interesting kind of how we think about this. And I suppose in proximity to racism and mental health, my whole thing is the residual effects. So what are the residual effects of carrying those burdens continuously? So I suppose conceptually, one of the things that I kind of want us to get us to think about is, I think Nancy is really, in a way that I would, and I know many other people would, has really kind of used humour, but also kind of spoken about the actual reality of dealing with that situation in a day-to-day basis. I would only presume it's exhausting. And that would be an obvious kind of thing to note from that. But what becomes even more intriguing with that is how we conceptualize that experience. So for me, conceptually, you have a situation where you encounter racism. You try and explain that racism to invariably white colleagues in the UK. So in the UK, 8.3% of academics are black. Or BAME, so black, Asian, and minority ethnic. If you actually drill it down to black, it's less than 3%. So that's not a massive critical mass to begin with. You explain to your white colleagues, I have just encountered racism. They turn around to you, and the retort is, you're being hypersensitive. Have you misread the situation? This is one of my favorite ones. That's purely subjective in conjecture. And you go through this kind of rigmarole of kind of lines that come out in kind of experiencing this. So imagine the idea of complaint. So Sarah Ahmed does a lot of work around the idea of complaint. You talk about this context and you explain and you go through due diligence and processes to basically say you're being racially harassed, and they fall on deaf ears. It's problematic. It's hugely problematic. So what ends up happening is that individual becomes a victim of something they never asked to experience in the first place. So the interesting thing about racism, in whatever historical context we find ourselves in, is that we always ask the oppressed to relieve themselves of a burden that they never asked to be placed with in the first place. So you're asking people, in many cases, that don't have any power, any agency, to relieve themselves of a burden they never asked to be in the first place. And then when they raise complaint, as Sarah Ahmed discusses about that, then we criticise them for doing that. We say that they're being hypersensitive, that they're taking everything to heart, they're playing the race card. That's a really good one that's used in particularly the US and the UK. And I suppose that symbolic violence is systemic. So, you see how it kind of, that idea of the racial microaggression. I know that, and it's one of our colleagues yesterday was talking about this tenseness of walking into a lift. It's hard to articulate to someone, I know I've just experienced racism, and it's interesting because to a person of colour, you don't have to explain it, but very often to white people, you have to explain what you've experienced. So that trauma it's multi-layered, it's double. You experience the violence in the first place, and then you have this situation where you have to actually explain to someone what you've experienced. which is always traumatic. So when you kind of think about how that kind of resonates with people, it's problematic. And one of the things that I always think about is, as a black male, how have I dealt with kind of the experiences I've had in the academy and the residual effects? So I often say, and it's probably quite a sad thing to say, but if I knew what I know now when I started out 6 years ago, I can honestly say I wouldn't have gone down this line of work. And I say that because there's just a lot of brown stuff I could have done without. I could have really done without it. Because the thing is, you never really get over it, but what you learn are ways to deal with it. And I'm saying that as a male. So if I remove the fact that I am a black male, as a male, I'm unfairly privileged over women. So I'm saying it from that perspective. So in essence, you could say I've had the best of it. I know black female colleagues that have had the same experience as I have, and they're nowhere near where they should be. And in many cases, they're better than me, they're qualified, they have more publications, they have lots of stuff, but they don't have the same type of capital I unfairly have as a male. So kind of that fetishization of the black body in that space becomes really, really important. And what we do have in the UK, which is a really critical thing, is the mental health care provision for dealing with these traumas doesn't exist. So in other words, it's not culturally appropriate. So you go to a healthcare professional, and sorry, I've got to give some context to this. My mum is a mental health nurse, and my younger brother's a mental health nurse, and my mum's a counsellor. So that's why I've been around this most of my life. So in terms of, you go to UK, you present an issue, which could be a residual effect of racism that's impacted your mental well-being. And often what the kind of case studies we work within is like, culturally, if we look at women of colour, it's because, and these are judgments that are made before anything is said, it's because there are cultural expectations on you, and that's the problem. So one of the things in a lot of the interviews we did, a healthcare professional said to a participant that, well, you're going to be married by the time you're 21, so that's going to cause a stress in itself, and that's mainly the problem. And the student said, no, I'm saying the problem is that I feel like I'm encountering racism from my tutors. It's got nothing to do with that. And that's a healthcare professional making that judgment. So in terms of that cultural kind of, those cultural and racial ascriptions, there's a stigmatization within those communities, in black communities around mental illness and mental health. You go to professionals and they stigmatize you, who often in the UK are white, and then you're left in this limbo where you're dealing with these problems on your own. And there's no kind of refuge for kind of displacing these things. And I think one of the things that's kind of really integral to that is this idea of kind of toxic masculinity as well. So for black males, there's always that kind of bravado that situates that around not talking about feelings, not expressing issues around mental illness. And a really alarming statistic in the UK is that the largest amount of people that commit suicide in the UK are men under the age of 40. And what that highlights, inevitably most of the time, is the plight of white men doing that. But no one in the UK, there isn't a discourse that talks about how black men experience mental illness and actually what they go through. Because for most black men, the first kind of iteration of kind of, I suppose, healthcare professionals or that kind of service is through the criminal system or the judicial system. In many cases, a system that systematically targets young black males in the UK. So that in itself is problematic. And then when we think of this idea of how women of colour negotiate this, it's twofold, because there are so many things that you're kind of negotiating in that discourse around being a woman, sexuality, fetishization, the idea of the angry black woman, the idea of having to almost justify your presence continually. And then there's also this notion that actually, as we've kind of discussed in the last couple of days, black men can be complicit in that. They can be complicit in that narrative in a way that isn't very helpful. So I've told a couple of people the story, but my mum often spoke about Nelson Mandela, me and my brothers growing up. And I remember I was about 16 or 17 at the time, and I said, and me and my brothers were kind of waxing lyrical about how great Nelson Mandela was. And she said, when you're in prison, how long was Nelson Mandela in prison for? So we was like, 25 years, 2 years on the house arrest, so 27 in all. She's like, okay, good. What do you think the point of going to prison is? You have your liberty taken away from you for doing something you shouldn't have done. Okay, good. But you can also wrongly be put in prison, as Nelson Mandela was in this case. So how do you think you can liberate a country from behind bars if your liberty's been taken away? So I was like, yeah, of course you can. It's like, no, it's actually impossible. Besides the fact that he was on a remote island, it's not possible to do it, Jason. So who do you think did the work in that time? I don't know. Joseph, who do you think did the work in that time? I don't know, Mum. Simon, who do you think did the work in that time? Don't know. Any take Gowan? Sorry, those are my brother's names. It's like, no. And so I said, Gif. Well, Mum's called Gifty. Just so you know, most Ghanaian women are called Gifty. So my mum's called Gifty. So I said, no, I don't know Gif. She's like, Winnie Mandela. Winnie Mandela is the one that did the work, that did the labour. And if you look in history, you're always in these situations where women do the heavy lifting, and then kind of men of colour, men just generally speaking, take the glory for that. And one of the things that's kind of really interesting is how this heavy lifting and this labour looks in higher education, particularly in the UK. You have a situation where for every one black male academic there is in the UK, there are 3 black female academics. Just to put it into context. But you have 27 black female professors, and you have 150 odd black male professors. What we often see in the UK is this lifting of diversity, inclusion, the admin that comes with that, the nurturing, and the idea of career trajectory doesn't exist because there's an expectation that you do that whilst negotiating all these kind of visceral racial aspects. And that is hugely, not only does it cause problems, there's a tax that comes with that. And that tax is not only a physical tax, it's a mental tax. And very often we don't have an out for that, and we have no way of recognising that. So I'm mindful of the time because the rugby's on. Also, I just want to say, and it's really important, sorry, not that I'm massively into rugby, but some people maybe, but just want to say I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's fantastic to kind of share this platform, and again, I just want to say, because it's really important, I'm very mindful that the opportunities that I have and that I've been given are purely based on the fact that there are women of colour, particularly in the UK and all over the world, who have done that labour for me to stand here. So if anything, this is a bigger thanks to them for allowing me to have this position. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Okay, so we open it to the floor for questions and comments.
My name is still Apio Bizani. I want to speak on to what Nancy said. I think, Nancy, you are very correct in pointing out that as black people in this country, we have had to, for a very long time, carry the burden of English. In the sense that we have to, in order to make it in life, assimilate into English, think in English, write our experiences in English, which is complete insanity upheld by these universities, including this one. On the other hand, our white compatriots have been committed to outstanding ignorance about our cultures, languages, and experience in this country. I mean, you can exist as a white person in this country and live comfortably without even knowing any of the indigenous languages. And that insanity, in part, is made possible by these institutions of power, including universities. I have learned that, I heard from the corridors of power of the university that on Monday, there will be a meeting about prospects of changing the language policy. And they only invited the students of the Faculty of Arts, which is quite interesting. It's very interesting. And I'm really hoping that the resolutions of the university will be such that indigenous languages, particularly Xhosa in this context, at least, becomes compulsory as a language that each and every student and staff must learn. And hopefully with the view that ultimately English will become, or isiXhosa will become a language of medium instruction. But I also wanted to ask you a question about your experiences with male students. I've heard that academics, female academics have been, in some instances, harassed by male students, even way younger male students. So can you please share your experiences around that? I have so many questions for JC, and I think I would abuse this platform, so I'll ask him in an informal manner. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to the members of the panel. I still think that one critical voice is missing. And in having this conversation, those who experience racism are speaking. Those who do not experience racism could probably make a difference in the conversation. I realized that when during the book launch on Thursday, that no white person spoke at that launch. So there could have been a difference if someone who doesn't experience racism was on this panel. I'm very impressed with how you've articulated this whole question, Aslam, and how individuals sort of deal with it, and also how institutions respond. When I look at the question of gender, for example, for about 15 years ago, in my university, the University of Ghana, we realized that gender was a problem, gender inequality, sexual harassment. And so individuals had already been trying to deal with it, particularly those who were doing research in gender. But the institution, as a result of the individual push, those critical voices, also had to step in. And then we decided, look, let's put together a Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy as part of that initial process. And so we're tasked to start developing a gender policy, which the university did not have, and then a sexual harassment policy. Now, as part of critical university studies, now what I think we should be doing now, at least in my space, would be to critique what responses we've had as individuals and as an institution to see how that is moving on. So, number one, I would like to know what you think about whether or not this conversation could have been different. This is after the fact. If someone who doesn't experience racism was on the panel, and also to give an example of how an institution like mine has been responding, and what I think in critical studies we should be doing to further that response. Thank you.
Thank you. It's actually a follow-up to Michael's point about how we're responding to this. My question, which is for all of you, is how do we go about transforming the narratives of a victimization or marginalization, whatever you want to put it, into narratives of emancipation? Or in other words, are there narratives where efforts from women that have really managed to liberate themselves? And I remember the book, the first book launch. It's got very interesting titles. Writing to Stay. And then if you ask them, so now we feel liberated. So I'd like to hear what in the UK, or in your case, there are some emerging stories about how women have managed to, get out of those situations. Now, Aslam, it's a very interesting point you make. Bembe is talking about these archives. I would like if you can actually elaborate on that. You know, I spoke about to look into the past and historicize. But archives, some are written, some are unwritten. Some are archives of facts of experience. And others are archives of intellectual legacy. So how do we really deal with that? I think that's when things become more complicated, even with Mbembe, because when he moves into that, he tends to privilege the written archive, and he gets stuck there.
I think two main points. Just first, I think, Jason, just responding to your presentation, I think what stood out for me about your presentation was that you really took that intersection of race and gender quite seriously. And I think, I know there was a comment yesterday about, we haven't even talked about disability, and we certainly haven't talked about sexual orientation or any of those things. And so it's just a challenge to us as a community of critical thinkers about higher education in terms of how we take intersectionality seriously in our work. So just that comment. But then also speaking to Prof. Fataar, and we clearly need to have a very long conversation at some point. I want to share two moments that I experienced this year with my team at the Transformation Office. One moment was when our communications officer was up for disciplinary, well, they were both up for disciplinary action. One was the communications officer for posting something on our social media page, which may or may not be read as bringing the university into disrepute. The second was for my other colleague whose job is in student engagement, that is her portfolio, for attending an SRC meeting where she made a comment which was critical about the SRC with regards to transformation. In both those instances, there was an order from senior leadership. One came from the rectorate, the other came from a senior director, that both these colleagues should be up for some kind of disciplinary action. What I found so interesting about that was that there was no question that they had in some ways violated a code of conduct or some kind of protocol or breached some kind of policy. It was just accepted that this was true. It was accepted by themselves. It was accepted by our manager. It was accepted even by our vice rector that there's been some kind of breach of conduct. What we found, however, is when I went to look at the staff code of conduct and all the policies that kind of could refer to these incidents, was there that there had been none. They had done nothing wrong. And so the question becomes, or the question I was sitting with was, A, how was it that this was first of all considered to be some kind of breach of code of conduct? And secondly, what was so powerful and considered so legitimate and so powerful in shaping and mobilizing a whole lot of people to go ahead with this, what is clearly a disciplining, a silencing, and a containment. What it really boiled down to is that in between the policy, the codes of conduct, is exactly that ghost of institutional culture at work, right? And for me, I think if we are, part of what I'm interested in is theorizing how those ghosts operate in between the policy, the procedure, right? And how it is that they are so powerful in actually shaping the behavior of individuals within our institutions, to the effect of having a deeply silencing effect. So, thank you.
Studies. As I listen to this discussion, I'm just wondering how critical university studies connects with the current, especially when I had Aslam with the opposing ontologies. Because if you look at the context that we find ourselves in, there are so many other marginalization aspects, just like she's raising the issue of people living with disabilities. It could be women, it could be so many other factors. And the way the discussion is more of the historical ones tend to overshadow the current ones. And then apart from that, we talk a lot about the institution, which is the university, yes, and that's where we belong. But university is also not a closed shop, University has to connect to society. So going ahead, does critical university studies also connect to the other institutions more with a desire to bring the change that everybody would like to see, which to some extent is happening in terms of inclusion policies that we see around? I'm just struggling with it, but I'm sure those who are in critical university studies could give me some insights into that.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but I'm just going to note Satish, and Norbert will go first, then Satish, and then Seppo. Is it Christy at the last? If everyone could then just try and keep it as short as possible so we can fit everyone in, please.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks, Chenzo. I think my comment is going to link a bit with what Prof. Michael was speaking about. Firstly, Jason, when we're discussing issues of gender, usually in South Africa, you'll find that the panel will be fully constituted of women, usually. Now, when the inclusion of men comes in, or when men ask, where are men, in the same way Prof. Michael is asking, where are the people who don't experience racism on the panel? The problem becomes that when men, for example, in discussion of gender or women's issues, when they get included, they think that suddenly their inclusion on the panel completes or advances the discussion, of which the discussion was complete and advanced already when women were there. In the same way, this particular panel is complete and advanced. To add a person who does not experience racism does not complete or advance the discussion, but it might offer a different perspective. And I think it leads then to the question or the thing that I'm struggling with right now, that when it comes to critical university studies, the concept of positionality, how does it influence how you can contribute meaningfully to a discussion on critical university studies or any discussion on decoloniality? When you think about, for example, who must be the decolonial agent? Do black people, because of their experiences and because of their lived experiences, become then the decolonial agents by default? Or do you then have to think around if we're being serious about reflexivity, about being critical of the self, plasticity of the self, Prof, does it mean that white people can also contribute if they do the white work, as Prof. Christie has said before? So I think that's where I'm struggling with that. Lendebuzongo, Prof. Michael, what significance does it have on critical university studies in that positionality has an influence as well on what you can actively contribute to this particular kind of study?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aslam and all the three members. I was really taken aback in terms of the self coming through very strongly, and I wanted to actually pick up on that. So yes, thanks to Aslam, I would fully endorse the fact about historicization of the decolonial project, particularly looking at the biography and autobiographies, which is really critical. And I'll have more conversations with you on that. But I'll pick up the point that Jason has raised, and also yourself, that you raised about gender. And I would take very quickly to explain that I opted to do gender studies, being an economist, to work on the issue of gender. So as a male stepping forward, say, I want to study the issues confronting women, okay? And the biggest response or reaction to that was, why the heck don't you work on agriculture and industry that everyone is doing? Why do you need to work on gender, okay? So I started the project, but I was not confident because, as I said, I'm entering into an area which is not outside my comfort zone. Luckily, I had an opportunity to go to IDS in Sussex for a training, along with all the civil servants. And there, the first week of that class, we were taken to the Rape Crisis Center in Manchester. Okay? Neil Kinnock was fighting for the elections, and there was the opportunity to really confront my own prejudices and everything that went. Trained me to become a better researcher and do that work. I don't wear a label of being a gender specialist, but I did that, and I get my students to do. So there is a perspective from the males as well as females that comes through, which we need to be aware of in terms of critical studies. The second aspect is in terms of the mental health. Internationalizing the university system is pretty much everywhere. We need more international students, but there's very little support system in terms of mental health, and that is a big issue, not just within the UK system, definitely I'm aware of. And I think the issue of talking therapies has become really critical in the context of mental health, but there's a lot to be discussed about. Thank you.
So I want to ask about the limits of race consciousness, mobilization, and thinking. I mean, we do know that race consciousness, negritude, race mobilization can never be emancipatory. At best, I mean, at best, I don't know. At best, it can be a transitory tactic, but it can never be the strategy. It can never be our telos, right? So how do we speak of race in order to overcome race? How would we know we have done enough? Because we don't want to be stuck in the race talk. We don't want that, right? We want to overcome race. So how do we use race in a tactical way, but not in a strategic way? I'm asking this about the limits of this because in 2006, I wrote a paper called Dismantling Institutional Racism at the University of Pretoria. And the response to that was that the university started doing two things. One, promoting women, and then two, promoting non-South African black people. And that put me and others on a back foot. How do we respond to that without seeming xenophobic and without seeming like we don't respect gender, you know? The second limitation, the limitation of the ontology of dispossession. That kind of ontology locks us into a pathology of alienation, where we constantly have to perform our blackness, leading to further mental illness. I mean, I'm thinking here, I don't like the word ontology of dispossession because it goes back to that mistranslation of Fanon's chapter, the fact of blackness. There's no fact of blackness. There's no ontology of blackness. There's no ontology of dispossession. Maybe the lived experience. So how do we reckon with those limitations?
So yes, we've got all the talk of spectres and death and so forth, and then we had those in the title of this panel, those ellipses, those three little dots, and into those three little dots, disappear our sexual others, obviously. So next to the spectre for me, the spectre of Foucault, floats the spectre of Judith Butler, who, as we know, wrote a book with the title The Psychic Life of Power, even though she's not yet a dead lesbian. Foucault for me is one of those funny, not uncomplicated examples actually of the Western white man who's now also conjured here as a representative of white epistemology. He is somebody who suffered mental illness. He tried suicide a number of times in the 1940s because he was a gay man. And that's a place from where he was writing. His first books come straight at that, out of that experience with psychiatry and psychology, which I'm sure Kupani can also confirm. So he tried, as I said, he tried to commit suicide a number of times. Ultimately, in the 1980s, he died of age-related causes. So that, for me, is also not quite the epitome of privilege. So I'm sort of seeing the spectre of the lesbian and the gay man sort of appearing and disappearing here. Also with a reference to Jeanette Winterson. And of course I welcome the idea of historicization. This is something that I firmly believe in and also try and practice in my own life. So some may have seen the poster that circulated with the 2015 protests that says, and it was also widely circulated on social media, and it's popped up at academic seminars and conferences, and it's a poster that says, "Dear history, please remember," well not please, actually no please there, remember that this event, Rhodes Must Fall, included women, queer, gender non-conforming people. So, and you know, for me, this is a push to obviously surface queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and so forth, positionalities and people, gender non-conforming people generally. And as we know, this also led to open physical battles on several of our campuses. People would have seen the photographs circulated on social media, where young women were being physically tackled, physically expelled from meetings dominated by black male nationalists. So, you know, in terms of this, you know, and one is a bit distressed that this call to be remembered, you know, is not heeded, you know, because, and I think why not? Why aren't we not heeding that? Because if we answer that call, of course, we have to then shine the light on heteronormativity, and we have to shine the light on patriarchy, and we have to look at how the spaces in higher education are riven with gender and sexual harassment, sexual violence, which is just part of the everyday experience of women, and I would include white women in that, in the higher education space, you know. So, and of course these violences we know have all to do with propping up male domination. So, so for me, we really, you know, we have to take seriously this call to shine the light on heteropatriarchy, also as it interacts with whiteness, but also as a power structure in itself, you know, which is absolutely, if you look at our higher education institutions in South Africa, are completely, this is that one seemingly untouchable power structure, the one of and I'm adding hetero here because we're missing that part big time. Also, just by referring to gender doesn't help us to get there. We need to use the word patriarchy clearly. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks to the panelists for this fruitful discussion, and I especially thank Jason for bringing in the whole concept of invisibility even while we are using the intersectionality framework. And in that regard, I would want to, for example, bring in the whole question of disabled women and how the positionality of the disabled women in the larger subject of gender and violence actually changes it, because while we talk of eve teasing, for example, in India as something which women don't like and they kind of protest against, I've read a narrative of a disabled Indian woman who said that I wish someone would look at me and actually tease me, because then at least I would feel more desirable. So you know how the whole narrative of the disabled women completely inverts the whole question of violence that we've been looking at. And similarly, it comes to when you look at the whole binary of, say, the Hindu woman and the Muslim man, who's stereotyped into very aggressive, sexually aggressive, who wants to marry the Hindu woman because he wants to convert her. But then what happens to the Muslim women is something which is completely rendered invisible, because she faces the wrath of the Muslim man as well as the Hindu woman, for example. So thank you for that. And the last point I want to come to is regarding the whole introduction of gender studies, women's studies in the university. I think India has gone this full circle. When we started off with women's studies, because there was this report in 1975 which proved that the status of Indian women is very low. And now we had such gender studies, women's studies programs coming in the university. While there was a lot of work being done outside the university, which was also very critical and very good, what was happening within the university, at least from the place that I come, is that these women's studies centers were again being, marginalized to a larger extent. And so it was only their responsibility to show how they're bringing in social change. But how to kind of look at gender, and gender, remember, is not just about masculinity and femininity, it's also about gender relations. So we're talking about feminist lens to use this. So it was then, although there was research being done, but there wasn't really enough mainstreaming again of the kind of research which was being done. So it was again kind of staying in an island. So I think what we'll also have to remember if we're thinking of bringing up such institutional centers is that there is the dialogue that this critical university studies is giving for people from all positionalities to speak to each other. And I think for me, as a women's studies person, I have been I've really learned very hard to, and learned it well, to kind of, that you can't do women's studies only within the women's studies, gender studies space. It has to speak to the larger university spaces to actually bring about social changes in any sense of the word. Yeah, thank you.
Unfortunately, have run out of time. So if I could just turn it to the panel just to give their final comments. If you could keep it as brief as possible, although there's a lot to talk about, because we need to get to the final reflections before lunch. Thanks.
Just to speak to Apiwe, and Apiwe, your question also came up, but I think brought a few things to mind, came to mind when Christy spoke. My experiences with with male students and with male staff, has been fairly difficult in moments, and those moments have contributed to the kind of psychological breakdown that you have in this hostile space. And Jason was 100% correct. A lot of the time my humor is the way that I navigate the space. So I often have my students come to me after they've left the program and say, how were you always so happy when you came to class? And yesterday after I taught Beloved, one of my male students checked up on me when I came here because he realized how heavy the lecture was. And he said, Nancy, how are you doing today? And that was just this moment of catharsis where I could tell him, it's heartbreaking for me to have to teach this novel. And then also to have to worry about putting slides like, do I have a proper choke cherry tree? Do I have a sycamore? Because that's so important in terms of the text, the imagery, the fact that instead of thinking of lynchings, she's thinking of the beauty of the trees, and she feels shame that she cannot deal with the trauma of the violence on the black body. But now a sycamore tree and a choke cherry tree means nothing to the students. So now I'm in tears thinking, oh, this woman's dead, this is a beautiful author, this book is more difficult, every year I read it. And now, is this the appropriate sycamore tree? And so one of my male students checked up on me yesterday, and that just gave me a sense of ease and a sense of peace. Then about 3 years ago, I had a student who wasn't my student, but I was teaching the bluest eye. Now, the fact that I was teaching the bluest eye is important to the overall story. So I'm teaching the bluest eye to my second year students, about 120 students in the class. And I'm teaching Pacola's obsession with blue eyes. And Pacola's character involves the talk of sexual abuse, violation, and the psychology of shame, racial self-hatred. And so the student who's not my student, he comes, I'm standing on the side of the class, there's a door here and there's a door there. So he walks in at this door, he sees I'm standing here, close to him, so he walks to the other door, and then he screams to my whole class, fuck her right in the pussy. And he walks out. So my first instinct is not to stand there. I put down everything, I said, just do your own thing. I run after him. The guy sees me running after him, he runs far down. Then I realized, oh shit, it's time now. So I said, can you just come back here? So he said, no. He walked on. So I went back to the class, and my students are looking like, the lecturer wanted to go fight? And they took out their Snapchats, and I was just like, guys, what would your response be in this situation? So now we ran out of time. Now I can't rehash this moment with the students. I go to my office, I write a long email. Some people in this room were privy to that email. No, Jenny, I'm time conscious, but the story needs to be told, okay? So some people have seen this email. It took me about 2 hours to draft this email to explain it. And while I was drafting the email, as this grievance and as this notification that this happened in my classroom, where, yes, for some people it's a running gag on the internet, but taken to its most extreme interpretation is that someone was inciting an entire group of students to rape me in a class where I'm teaching students about violation and physical abuse and psychological abuse. No? And then those students didn't think it was much of an issue. They were taking their Snapchats out because they wanted to get a reaction meme, you know, a viral video. So what happens now? I write a long email to all the line managers, everybody, goes quiet for a few months. Then about a year later, the thing gets picked up again, and my line manager, one of the senior line managers, asked me, so what should be done? And by this time, I'm hurtful because I'm like, it's not my duty, and I wrote in the email, it's actually not my job to figure out what should be done. You know, and then but then I still list, because now I must list. So now I like basic things. Why don't we have sexual harassment posters up on campus? Why don't students know the sexual harassment hotline? Because something has to be done, because now I'm teaching the Bluest Eye, but I'm also teaching Makosazana Klaba, and I'm teaching Habiba Badaroon, both of who talk about gender-based violence, and my entire class is saying, but Nancy, this was obviously written in the 1980s because this kind of violence, domestic violence, doesn't happen anymore. And then my response is like, in whose world? You know, where? So then I must also write that in, why it's important for my teaching practice that you deal with this issue on an institutional level. About another 6 months later, I get an email saying, we couldn't get hold of the student, but the student's record has been blocked. The student was called for a disciplinary hearing. Nothing further than that is the culmination of that whole process for me. Yeah? So now, as that is happening, I have to go back to that same classroom the following week. And so I have to redesign my lecture for that week and say, okay, I know that we are supposed to continue with the book, but we are going to take the first 15 minutes of today's class and we're going to talk about what happened last week. Do you understand that nobody talks to you like that? Do you understand that this context is meant to be a safe space for all of us? And do you understand that that was not only a violation of me, that was a violation of you and your experience in this class? You know? So now that becomes your teaching process. So that's part of it. Thank you.
Yep, sorry, in terms of some of the comments that were made, I'm just going to pick up on a couple. Sorry, our colleague that was here, the ... Sorry, that's the easy way to remember it. I definitely think in terms of ideas around gender, particularly sexuality and heteronormativity, I think that's really, really important. If I take a UK context, the thing is that that particular presentation is always through a white lens. So, for example, in terms of how queer black women experience that type of discrimination, that's not something that's always considered in the same way. And I suppose one of the things that I think is really important is that male patriarchy, it's got to be relative to a context. So I deliberately always position myself as a privileged black male, but actually in reality, I'm a working class black male from South London, and any privilege I have measured against a white woman, as an example, I would be massively disadvantaged. But I recognize that against women of color, I am hugely unfairly privileged. So I always kind of think that positionality is really, really important. I also recognize how particular groups experience disability differently, and I think that is a really, really important point. And something that in the UK, I would say, and it's just my opinion, that context, disability, sexuality doesn't get ignored in the UK, purely because the context around it, there's a huge policy and public push around that. But actually that push isn't necessarily in favour of queer black studies, to be specific. And that is an interesting phenomenon, because how that is experienced from a black phenomenon is actually completely different, because measured against an intersectional approach, it's conflated, that experience. So sexuality becomes conflated. Religion could come into that. Class, race obviously can come into that. So those things I think are really important. I think Michael made a really good point around someone that hasn't experienced racism, how that may, what their viewpoint will be like. I suppose what I would say historically is that the narrative of racism and race has been preferred by white people, by and large. And it's only in recent times that actually people of colour have taken charge of that narrative and been able to talk about their own plights. So I would always probably advocate, and this is just my personal view, I would always advocate hearing the lived experiences rather than giving more of a platform to white people to talk about racism in terms of on behalf of black people. Because I think we already know that side of it. What we don't know is how black people experience racism. Because in terms of them talking about their experiences, this is actually quite a recent phenomenon. Because if we think about it from a research context, there was always that trivialization of black people talking about their racialized experiences as not academically rigorous, it's not proper research, it's purely anecdotal. So I think that's quite important, because in the UK especially, there are a lot of white academics that have benefited from the plight of racism, but they haven't actually done a lot to mobilize those individuals experiencing that oppression or that racism. And by the way, that goes across many intersectional approaches. So you have men that do research on gender, but don't ever do anything to mobilize the plight of women. You have people that study disability, but they've never done anything to mobilize that. You know, religion, and it's the same. So it's not just exclusive to race, it's exclusive across that whole spectrum of intersection, where you do have, normally at the helm, men exploiting that plight. So I think that's quite an important thing. And last but not least, I think in terms of kind of talking about silencing and containment of racism, I think one of the things that's really important is that I used to work with someone who used to always say to me, Jason, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And I'm an idealist at heart. And I think one of the things that I always think about is the idea of reimagining what this whole thing could look like. Now, most of the people I meet, I ask them, they ask me, do you think racism will always exist? And I say to them, as an idealist, I believe no. Because what would be the point in living to think that we would have the same problem, for time memorial? And yes, there are a lot of sociological factors that might mean it could be around, but as someone that's a parent, that's not a vision, or that's not a future I envision for my own children. So there's no way I would entertain the idea that any form of inequality across any intersection would be around. So I do think reimagining that, the reimagining, we can prefer the problems, but I suppose the solutions are that we have a collective critical mass. And I know there's that whole thing of the echo chamber and preaching to the choir, but actually it's kind of tiny drops make a mighty ocean, and how we can all use our privilege and agency to disrupt the patterns of inequality we see across all the varying intersections. Thanks.
Okay. I don't exactly know what I'm going to say now, so I might surprise myself. I want to attempt to just run through some of the stuff that has been raised here. With regard to language policy, I want to argue that language policy is worked out and given expression within particular contingent environments. So where English is violently regarded as the dominant language that suppresses other languages, in Stellenbosch University, English was positioned as the language of accessibility. So that if we didn't move towards English, we would have been keeping black students out, which then creates other problems about multilingualism and so on and so forth. So contingency is very important, and historicization of the language problem is very important. The missing voice. Those who do not experience racism. I think we are in a liminal space, is that the right word, where the black voice is being invoiced, necessarily so in a relatively exclusionary manner. I want to ask, on what basis, when, and on what terms can that voice become inclusive of everyone, even those who have been previously advantaged? Under what conditions? When do we impel that? We have to ask that question. When does the moment of exclusion stop? Thirdly, how to transform in such a way that move from victimization to your word, Michael, to emancipation. It's located in part of the answer that I have just given you. Victimization is also to be understood within particular contingent contexts. There is an extremely important role for enunciating the ground that we stand on in respect of how it positions us, right? And then working with that ground. That's all we have to move forward and not be trapped by the very ground that we've dug and for ourselves. Archives, the written archive. I think literature, I think what you mentioned yesterday, street languages, rap and so on, is a very, very visceral archive to be explored through a diversity of heterodox methodologies. I think, for example, a book that I want you to read by the black author, Yvette Christiansen. She writes about slavery. She writes a book called The Unconfessed, where she imagines slavery. I also want to alert you to a book by André Pierre Brink. It's called Falida, where he, from his perspective, imagines context of slavery. That's an archive that we ought to be working. But there's also popular literature. The Mafia of Stellenbosch can tell you something about rugby, boerewors, braaivleis, and that kind of a thing. The Death of Russell Botman, published by Carolus and Davi Carolus, whom I have no clue. He wrote a book. You can buy it for $3 on Amazon. You can read it immediately. The work by Professor Brink, who joined us, and writings about him, how he was hounded out of Stellenbosch. During his 5 years of trying to change. So that is where the intersectional comes from, right? There are moments and exemplifying experiences that's in front of us that we can excavate beyond the narrowness of our own politics. You ask the most important question, Professor, about critical university studies. There are political, economic dimensions that undergird all of these epiphenomenal conversations that we have, right? It's neoliberal performativity at stake. It's the lack of resources. It's living in the underbelly, on the underside of higher education, where these conversations are had. But in the dominant parts of the university, the capitalizing logics are at play around questions of data, around questions of so-called fourth industrial revolution that positions university in complex ways, the 90% dominant part of the university in complex ways. You want me to stop? Okay. Okay. Two more points. Around this question of ontologies of disposition, ontologies of conquest, it is my metaphoric moment that I give to myself to express the confoundment of the moment. But I immediately move to history and sociology to give it a language. That's what I'm trying to do there with that, right? But it's a complicated moment. It's a dance of ontologies that clash. But how do you bring it to some kind of a descriptive consciousness? The question of heteropatriarchy, for me, that is an exceptionally important question. It's a question that, and the question, of course, of Muslim men, of which I'm one, right? It is a question that I'm utterly alert to, and utterly alert in my own positioning in respect of it. That's the question that male patriarchy has to confront all the time. And we have to be open to that. And we have to confront it in ways in which is strategic, tactical, and principled. And so that is what I wanted to say some more things, but that's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much to the panel. I wish we had more time, but Andre needs to get to the reflections. Andre and Dina?
Sorry, brilliant. Thank you so much, panel. Can we just applaud as they leave the stage? Thank you. Before we have tea and Andre sums up with the reflections, it was really important for us in thinking about the framing of the questions to look at the way in which critical university studies is operating in quite powerful ways and positioning itself in the northern context, and to try and bring it into proximity with some of the many, many troublings of what's going on in the space. And what's fascinating about having the continual disruptions, which are fantastic, of lived experience in the midst of this, is it keeps bringing in the sense of urgency with how we work as scholars and practitioners. But there is a real challenge about the constructions of things like gender and race and how they operate within the normative frames of the university and within scholarship that can very, very easily marginalize them and separate them from the discussions that are at the root of critical university studies, which is why we've brought it in here and brought it in with discussions of where does the African sit in relation to the university? Where does settler colonialism relate? Because certainly my sense, which was part of the concern in the discussion, was that there is a separation. And you can talk about critical university studies as part of the world without linking it to any spectre of how it's operated in the world. So there's a real concern about how to bring together the pragmatic frames that help us on an individual level to deal with issues of mental health challenges, to deal with what happens on an individualized level of the body, to deal with positionality and privilege, but then how there can be very, very easy way of domesticating the larger ways in which solidarity can be built to address the larger machinations of domination. And those are, of course, institutional, but of course, geopolitical. So thank you so much for negotiating part of that with us. And please enjoy tea time. We'll come back with reflections. No, we're not doing tea. Okay. Okay. Okay, no tea. Andre will come and facilitate the reflections now. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, just so that the last session also gets framed into a reflective kind of thematics. I must say that I really enjoyed, and Nancy, of course, your presentation then ties in the question of the distribution of misrecognitions, and of course to work against those with the idea of performativity. So that is another frame then that came through the last roundtable. And of course the question of surveillance has been affirmed in that space. Jason, your presentation around the question of race and mental health, of course, that plays into so many of the issues at play, and of course ties in with Kopano's presentation last night as well. You know, the different sets of roles in which the disciplines play into the construction of the university and its patterns of oppression. And then Aslam, of course, the interpretive scheme of the ghost around the question of institutional culture is highly productive. So one has to think of that. But I also want us to think of Stellenbosch as a particular type of animal, which is probably on a spectrum in both a space where it is simply incapable of engaging with its own history. You know, so that university has to, in our own minds, we have to grasp with that particular university and its construction around the Stellenbosch socioeconomic space in that. So, and I'm not so sure how to engage with that, apart from the fact that there are also pockets of good work at Stellenbosch University, of course, as we all know, in different kinds of institutions. So one has to think for Claire and Aslam has to think about how do you guys take that particular work back into that space. But I do think that the schemata of the ghost would be very useful in any case to think through that spaces. I also would like to just say, because I left out sometimes the moderators who have prepared so well, for locating some of these roundtables. And for yesterday's roundtable, I forgot just to say this morning, Kopano and Tsepo and Christy as well. And of course, those introductory remarks have always been very, very useful. I want to come back then. The question of thinking praxis at the edge of thought, as came through the presentation of Crane yesterday, would be something that we will have to think of as we move ahead, and trying to dislodge our own receivable thoughts, dislodging it as we move ahead, because I like the way in which Sibongile tries to grapple with the question of the university working against itself almost. You see, a university working against itself, you know, to almost at the disciplinary level, but at an institutional level, reconstitute in that moment of working against itself, its institutional culture. Very, very difficult stuff to do, as you all know. But I think that just the way in which the presentation has gone, there is massive, massive space for counter practices within the universities. You know, a point that Tony was very emphasized actually in his presentation. The question of victimization and emancipation, I think it's probably I suppose it's a pair, you know, that runs together in different kinds of ways, no? Because that particular grounding which provide the basis from which one have to think forms of emancipation is very important. And Aslam, I do like your idea, you know, of a moment in history that has so many complications. It's very complicated complexities at play, but as you would know, it also provides for different sets of options and possibilities. No? So I must say, you know, from Dina and my side, we're actually very happy that we have the varieties of ideas, you know, to take forward. So, yeah, so the last session, so that I don't stand here all by myself, if anybody wants to have some final words, because there are people who will be leaving us today, and there will be some who will stay behind, and we're going to work further on Monday and Tuesday. And of course, we already regard this just by the informal discussions as a particular network. And we will circulate the ideas coming from Monday and Tuesday into this particular network, you know, in the way, you know, around the question of how we take this discussion forward. Chief?
The reason I'm starting is selfish, you know, because I want to sneak in something. Thank you so much. Chair, you know, one of the things that I've learned, especially when dealing with the matters of, because I'm dealing with transformation at my work, and that includes some of the subject of gender and gender-based violence, disabilities, and so on. Now, my experience usually has been about when dealing with activists of gender equality, encountering, you know, that space being a bit confrontational. And what I think is more meaningful and changing to one's behavior is more of education than you know, the confrontation. So Nancy, for instance, when talking about language and literature in your case, I think on my side that one of the things is about, should be about being educated to change our language, to be able to converse and to be able just to have these things coming naturally as we speak. Come naturally that, you know, because some people make honest mistakes and some people, of course, they make these deliberately. But just to have these as, you know, as part of our daily language. And the final thing, Prof, you know, I'm curious, maybe if we can hear the comments, you know, from colleagues that are going to speak. I'm curious here on the colleagues from outside South Africa. Because when we talk transformation in South Africa, there is a particular theme that runs into that, and it's based on our lived experience in the past, and therefore we want to transform. And when we talk decolonialization, it also relates to that. And last year we had a colloquium on transformation, and one of the themes there was to understand what exactly we mean by transformation. So to the colleagues that are from outside, what is your understanding of transformation, and what do you deal with when you deal with transformation in your countries? Because the subject of transformation in higher education is a universal subject, and it's always there. But of course, each country has got its own take on what transformation means, and so I would like to hear that. I know this is not a summary, but it's something that I missed to ask yesterday. Sorry, Prof.
Chief is like a typical student in a mass meeting,
I want to make a point which is related to my own reflection about the experience, which has been very rich and useful to my own thinking. When I was sitting there in that venue for the book launch, I was sitting next to Chief, and Chief kept on saying, I'm impressed by these students and the young scholars. Then this morning I was walking and I was talking to, I managed to bump into Iron, and we spoke about a book, a manuscript that we were working on SATU. And one of the reflections was that you can really learn a lot from the history, the point that Aslam was pointing to. And it made me reflect about groups like this, networks like this, what they can lead to. In the 80s, it's actually in the 80s, debates like this taking place. For whatever reasons, and it's linked to a point, sorry, I want to be quick, that Aslam was commenting yesterday, saying, Michael, that green, and the book with the green cover that nobody read, it wasn't read that much because it was published by Scotterville Publishers. So that was the context. And and published by Scotterville Publishers. That's the book. The title of that was, the subtitle, From Struggles of Resistance to Struggles of Transformation. It was a reflection about the lessons at the time. Because at the time there was this view that if you really want to achieve your goals, you have to think about the alternative and make it explicit that there's a better world. In terms of theory, the efforts led to the book Apartheid, Callaway's book. Callaway's book, which came with a new theoretical framework, political economy. Maybe it wasn't the best, but that's how it happened. In terms of policy, it came to the idea that was mentioned about, people's education for people's power. In terms of policy, the NAPI initiative that led to all these reports. So there was always, but there was one thing related to the psychology. Psychology, and it's very important. It wasn't mentioned there. There was a network led by young scholars. And those young scholars were made up or led by Cheryl Arday, who became a vice chancellor at UP. Anjana Parekh, a DVC at UJ. Norman Duncan is a DVC at UP. Just quickly, they established a network because they didn't like the kind of psychology they were dealing with. They say, we're going, as black scholars, produce a new reader on psychology. We didn't mention there, but that's the first text, reader, produced by black scholars. So all I'm trying to say here is that one of the lessons that I would like it's an appeal, that as we move on, let's think about the outcome of this. Is it just a program? It's just theory reflection, our reflection about theories. Let's think about something that at some point will say, yes, we're concerned, we engage in a dialogue, and we produce this, and this has made some difference in our experience. That's the point I want to make about that. And I'm talking to young scholars. I'm talking to students mainly, not necessarily to the old guard that we have here.
Thank you, Michael. And I certainly think one of our aims is to unsuture the space of critical studies of the university and its traditions for early career scholars, definitely.
I'd just like to be briefly and also just respond to the panel and thinking about historicizing theory and historicizing theory on the level of intersectional struggles, especially feminist, queer, trans studies, decolonial struggles that have produced frameworks like the coloniality of gender, they have produced decolonial queer understandings. They are constitutive for societal analysis and are not part of the disciplinary modus of how universities get organized. Decolonial, feminist, queer, trans networks are actually autonomous networks. I have created such a network in Gießen, and I'm not getting any institutional support or funding. It's an amazing group of scholars, PhDs, students, postdocs, some colleagues, but we are not part of a development structure. And I don't think this will change. And so just to keep in mind also for the project of critical university studies, that there's a long tradition of queer, decolonial, black, feminist, intersectional struggle and theory production that actually made us, have enabled us to do the kind of work we are actually presenting today and are able to talk about ontologies of dispossession, but also emancipation.
So we will only have Shirley and then...
I'm going to be quick, I won't take up much time. I think for me it's important to say that the study of racism is always an intersectional enterprise. That is certainly how I approach it, and many other scholars of racism approach it as well, especially feminists do that. But I wanted to say something specifically about the thing about ghosts, right? Because Claire mentioned it as well, and Aslam mentioned ghosts. And I don't want to use the term ghost, because for me, it's not a ghost, it's an absolute brick wall. The thing that we need to think about instead is how it is that organizational processes and interpersonal processes like white bonding are like very pervasive in institutions and lead to the deniability of racism itself. So what needs to change to prevent this white bonding and this deniability of racism? So therefore, racism just melts into thin air, like Lewis Gordon says. We need our white colleagues to really look into the white psyche itself, which also affects us, because as Frantz Fanon says, you know, colonialism impacts white and black people differently, of course, because one is about domination, one is about subjugation, right? So what it is that we need to look at about ourselves that will enable transformation to occur. And something I said yesterday I'll go back to, not just because I think I'm so good, but because I think it's really significant to think about what we suit ourselves to as disciplines, as ways of thought, but as ways of being in the world also, right? Because that is important. So white bonding needs to be also analyzed, you know, by white people themselves and what that gives them and what they need to do about that.
Okay, great. So it's been an amazing few days. Thank you so much, Andre, for the invite. I really enjoyed the discussions here today. And we touched on the fact that yesterday that, right, the university is a reflection of the society. And as a result, then that means that the university is an expression of it. And I think that it would have been really great if we also had some discussions about how the university itself can sort of drive gender transformation, especially for me coming from an African political theory sort of background. I think it's important for us to talk about the intellectual contributions, especially the historical intellectual contributions of women writers. Tozama April's PhD talks about the intellectual contributions of Charlotte Maxeke, and there are so many others. There's so many other female writers, right, who we can sort of insert their voices into the academic space. And I think that that's something that we also need to do and consider in terms of just design. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. Just to say that Jenny will be afterwards circulating in our processes of this a request for people to contribute texts that they feel are really, really important as a reading list. And so many have highlighted this today.
I just want to say, I find it interesting having listened to the presentation on the first day by Shelley and then the presentation today by Jason. I know racism takes varied forms and oppression takes varied forms and its pervasiveness is varied. But I found it interesting that the UK experience in institutions of higher learning is very much related to what we are currently experiencing in South African universities. And I thought that that is something that we might need to explore further, moving from this winter school, because the things that they were saying on the first day and today, it's as if it's copy and paste of our reality as South Africa. And of course, I believe it comes from our colonial past, but it is something that needs to be untangled, and the emancipatory imaginations need to emerge out of that. Thanks.
Thank you. So colleagues, thank you very much for these reflections. Andre, do you want to come? Okay. And just to say, this might be the last time that we see some of you. So thank you to those of you who have come for the 3 days. It's been, you've all made incredible contributions. And I'm hoping that you have a sense that you've contributed in a strong enough way that those of us who are staying for Monday and Tuesday can use that in the workshopping and that it's centralized. If not, please take a whole lot of people aside and reassert it again, all right? So thank you for all of you from coming, from those from far away, from those on campus, and really giving of your time and presence. Thank you to the moderators who did a fantastic job in framing, provoking, and reshaping the discussion. It's been fascinating to sort of hear the spaces in between and how they've negotiated that. And then I'd like to ask the CriSHET team to please, if you can, all come to the back there, and if we can all turn around and just applaud them. They've done a fantastic, fantastic job. Jenny, do not stay on the side. Please go in the middle. And Derani. So we are, thank you. Kopano's now part of the team, I like it. We see all the labor that you put into this, and we so hope to see you really contributing to scholarship in this area. Let's hope this process enables you in your own careers and in your own intellectual contribution to this space. Then also to thank the caterers. The food has been nice, huh? Right? We had so many discussions about the food. And the videographers. These recordings are really important for those who couldn't be here right now and who are interested, who are following. Those who have been on social media will get a sense of how much traffic we're getting. A lot of us are getting emails left, right, and center, and we just couldn't include everyone. So what you record is really important. Thank you. Thank you to the Fine Art Department that gave us this drawing room, which you can see from the easels is literally their drawing room. There are some of us who are quite invested in the creative arts having a role in these discussions in time, so let's hope this is the beginning of something. And then thank you to Andre. Without whom we wouldn't be here. Thank you. We all are learning from you, Andre. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. And we'll see some of you on Monday. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Did you